Good morning, everyone. It is Monica McDougall here, pastor at Attica First United Methodist Church, and it is a joy to be with you all this morning for another worship video. Today is Sunday, August 13th, 2023, and we are in week 2 of our August sermon series, I Love to Tell the Story, an exploration of some of the parables of Jesus. This morning, we will be working with possibly the most famous of Jesus' parables, the parable of the prodigal son, which comes from the Gospel of Luke. Specifically this morning, I will be reading Luke chapter 15, verses 11 through 32, and I'll be reading them from the Common English Translation. So join me as we prepare our hearts and minds for worship this morning and hear these words from the Gospel of Luke. Jesus said, "A certain man had 2 sons. The younger son said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the inheritance.' Then the father divided his estate between them. Soon afterward, the younger son gathered everything together and took a trip to a land far away. There he wasted his wealth through extravagant living. When he had used up his resources, a severe food shortage arose in that country, and he began to be in need. He hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. He longed to eat his fill from what the pigs ate, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired hands have more than enough food? But I'm starving to death. I will get up, go to my father, and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son. Take me on as one of your hired hands.' So he got up and went to his father. While he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was moved with compassion. His father ran to him, hugged him, and kissed him. Then his son said, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quickly, bring out the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Fetch the fattened calf and slaughter it. We must celebrate with feasting, because this son of mine was dead and has come back to life. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now his older son was in the field. Coming in from the field, he approached the house and heard music and dancing. He called one of the servants and asked what was going on. The servant replied, 'Your brother has arrived, and your father has slaughtered the fattened calf because he received his son back safe and sound.' Then the older son was furious and didn't want to enter in, but his father came out and begged him. He answered his father, 'Look, I've served you all of these years, and I have never disobeyed your instruction. Yet you've never given me as much as a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours returned after gobbling up your estate on prostitutes, you slaughtered the fattened calf for him.' Then his father said, 'Son, you were always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and now is alive. He was lost and now is found.'" The word of God for the people of God. Praise be to God. So I've mentioned this before, but I worked at a bank for a year before I started seminary. Now, because bank tellers are, at least for now, human beings, errors are not uncommon. It's easy to transpose a number, to miscount the cash in a deposit, to actually hand out an extra bill, to run a transaction incorrectly. Mistakes like these are tiny, easy to correct, and expected, so most banks have procedures in place in order to handle these types of mistakes. But one day as a bank teller, I made a big error, a huge error actually. You see, one of our customers came by to cash a check. This check was a counter check from another bank nearby. For those of you who don't know, a counter check is a check that's made at the bank branch instead of being sent to you by a check company. Typically, counter checks are used by people who don't write checks often enough to require an entire book. So they go into their bank and ask for a counter check, and the teller will go and print the bank's routing number and the customer's account number onto a single check for them to use for a transaction. So the customer I was helping that day had received a counter check from a friend who purchased a piece of farm equipment for him, and the check was for around $900. At first, this transaction occurred as normal. The customer came in, he handed me the check, asked for it to be cashed. I asked him how he would like to receive that cash back. He requested 50s and 100s. I processed the transaction, acquired the cash from my drawer, and counted it back to him. He thanked me, took the cash, went about his day, and I got back to work. Nothing out of the normal there, right? Well, later on in my shift, one of my coworkers began what we referred to as submitting a batch. And this is where he would basically take all of our physical paper copies of the transactions we had done that day, and he would scan them through the computer so a software can make sure that they matched up and that there were no errors on those slips. And usually the errors that would be flagged in this process would be those tiny errors, right? Transposed numbers, wrong codes, things like that. And then we would quickly correct the transaction and re-scan the paperwork. But that night, a major error was flagged on the counter check I had processed for our customer. Because you see, the check didn't have an account number printed on it, which basically meant it was a worthless piece of paper. Turns out that whichever teller at the other bank made the counter check for our customer's friend had printed the bank's routing number, but had forgotten to print the customer's account number. And so again, that check had no worth because there was no way for our bank to acquire the funds. So I had essentially handed out $900 of our bank's money without any way for us to make that money back. So it's a pretty major error. Our bank's manager had already left for the day. We were almost at close. But my coworker informed me that I would need to call my manager, explain what had happened, and ask him what we should do. I was terrified. I knew that this was a big mistake because every other offage I had seen reported before mine had been $100 or less, but mine was nearly $1,000. So I was just convinced that when I got my manager on the phone, he was probably going to give me a very sternly worded lecture. I would be written up for this mistake. It would be really bad for me. When he answered, I explained the situation. I ended it with a profuse apology, and then I braced myself for that lecture, for that punishment. "It's okay, Monica," my manager started out. "Mistakes happen. Here's what we'll do next." I was so surprised by my manager's gracious response that he had to repeat his instructions to me because I didn't hear them the first time. My manager told me to contact our customer, explain the situation, ask if he would bring the cash back, and contact his friend to receive a new correct counter check. We also called the other bank to give them a heads up of what had happened. Our customer was clearly annoyed by the inconvenience, but he was more annoyed with the other bank's mistake than he was with me. He returned the cash. He went and got a new and corrected check. We redid the transaction. All was well. When my manager came into work the next day, I popped into his office to apologize again for my mistake and to thank him for being so kind to me. He told me that I didn't need to apologize again, that he knew that my apology over the phone the night before was sincere. He had no doubt that I would learn from this mistake and that I would check over checks more carefully in the future. And then he said to me, "Monica, I was once a year one teller too. It easily could have been me. It is so easy for us to make mistakes like that. Try to remember that you're a bank teller, not a neurosurgeon. No one is going to die when you make a mistake at work." And that statement has struck with me ever since. Because I've had other bosses at other jobs who would have never let me hear the end of that mistake. It would have been brought up over and over and over again. I would not be able to escape it. So it's not lost on me how blessed I was that my manager at the bank that day was someone who chose to lead with patience, grace, and empathy. Well, in today's parable, we meet another such leader. As I said at the start of this video, this week is our second of 4 weeks exploring specifically the parables of Jesus. My goal for this series and review is to learn more about parables as tools for storytelling, but also to learn how we can share the story of Jesus with others. Because how we tell a story matters, right? Well, today's parable is the famous parable of the prodigal son. This parable is well known and well loved. American essayist Ralph Waldo Emerson once remarked that this parable is, quote, the greatest story ever told, a claim that was seconded by English author Charles Dickens. That's a big claim, right? The greatest story ever told. But I can't say that I disagree. It's short and simple, but still captures the reader's attention. It features compelling characters, conflict, and suspense. And of course, its ending subverts expectations. Because where most readers would assume that the lost brother would be rejected upon his return, chastised for his behavior, and told to be more like his responsible older brother, the story ends instead in a celebrated return for the brother once lost. This story is a story of redemption and forgiveness, and as such, it is one that we tend to be moved by. Because after all of us will need to be forgiven at some point in our lives. This story gives us hope that even when we really screw up, when we make big mistakes, when we fall short, that there is a possibility of reconciliation. But those of you who heard my sermon last week know that parables have purpose beyond simply entertaining us or giving us hope. They are meant to be instructive. Parables are earthly stories meant to convey heavenly truths. They are meant to give one a closer look at who God is and what the kingdom of God looks like. This parable is unique to the Gospel of Luke. Now, a quick aside here about language. The text never actually describes the lost son as prodigal. The Gospel of Luke was written in approximately 85 AD in the 1st century and was likely originally in the Greek language. The son is only ever described in Greek as the younger son, not the prodigal son. The word prodigal comes from much later in the 16th century, originating from the Latin prodigus, meaning wasteful, and the Latin prodigiere, meaning to drive away or to waste away. It's a label assigned to this character in this story from a much later point in history than the text itself, probably because of what was going on in the world then, right? The term prodigal must have been more relevant to them in the 16th century than it would have been than thinking of the son purely in terms of the amount he wasted was in the 1st century. They focused more on the fact that he was lost than the fact that he was wasteful. But the parable of the prodigal son as we know it today is one of 3 stories that Jesus tells in this section of Luke to a mixed group of Pharisees and legal experts who were intermingled with tax collectors and sinners. And they were listening to Jesus teach while eating a meal. The Pharisee and the tax experts, and the legal experts rather, are said to be, quote, grumbling, per usual, about Jesus' penchant for dining with sinners. They don't believe that they should be sitting at the same table as tax collectors and sinners, these evil, unrighteous people, right? The other 2 stories that Jesus tells at this dinner are also parables, the parable of the lost sheep and the parable of the lost coin. Do you sense a theme there? Right? The title of this entire chapter in the Common English Bible is, quote, occasions for celebration, referring to this overarching thesis that when someone finds something that had been lost, they should rejoice. You see, with the first 2 parables, Jesus pulls from a very ordinary human experience to set the stage for this story of the prodigal son. Losing items, objects, stuff, is something that all of us experience countless times throughout our lives. In fact, I'm so bad about misplacing my keys that my husband bought little tracking devices to put on them so that when I lose them, I hit a button on my phone and an alarm goes off so that I can find where they were, which really came in handy when my church keys were lost in a box after our last move. And we all know that there's nothing quite as instantly satisfying as finding something that was lost, right? So Jesus uses this human experience of finding lost property to connect with his audience. Surely if you lost one of your sheep, you wouldn't just throw up your hands and say, well, I guess I'm down a sheep. No, that sheep is worth something to you. So you would go out and try to find it. And when you did, you would joyfully return it to the flock. Likewise, if you were missing some amount of money, you would do whatever you could to try and find it because money has value, right? And then when you found it, you would spend it on something that was important to you. Maybe you would put it in savings because saving is important to you. Or perhaps you would host a party for your friends. No doubt the Pharisee and the legal experts are listening to these two parables and thinking, okay, yeah, we agree that finding something that's lost is good and exciting. What's your point? So Jesus gets to the point. If finding a lost object is cause for celebration, shouldn't finding a lost person be too? And that is really the crux of the story of the prodigal son. In this context, it's easy to see who the characters of this story are meant to represent in Jesus' real world. The father is God. The lost son is the tax collectors and the sinners. The older son is the Pharisee and the legal experts. As Jesus begins to tell this story, the Pharisee and legal experts probably think they already know how this story ends. Surely the wasteful, reckless, sinful son, when he returns to his father, will be met with judgment and ridicule. He will be told to be more like his big brother. For the big brother was loyal and responsible and is the only one truly worthy of celebration. But instead, the lost son is greeted literally with open arms. The text tells us, while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was moved with compassion. His father ran to him, hugged him, and kissed him. Then the father exclaims, "We must celebrate with feasting because this son of mine was dead and has come back to life. He was lost and is found." At this point in the story, I imagine the audience was completely captivated. Did the Pharisee and legal experts begin to protest? Did the tax collectors and sinners holler in support of this lost son's redemption? We don't know for sure, but Jesus knows that he will face criticism for the story, so he gets ahead of that. Because in the story, the older son arrives on the scene and says what I'm sure the Pharisee and the tax collectors are thinking. He says, "But I've served you all these years and I've never disobeyed your instruction. Yet you've never given me as much as a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours returned after gobbling up your estate on prostitutes, you slaughtered the fattened calf for him." In other words, the older son is shouting, "But Dad, that's not fair." And the parable closes with the father's words, "Son, you were always with me, and everything I have is yours, but we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is now alive. He was lost and is now found." Essentially, the father, representing God, says to his eldest son, representing the Pharisee and the law experts, he says to them, "I love you. I'm grateful for your hard work. I appreciate your loyalty. You will be rewarded in due time. But right now, this moment is not about you." And that is a tough pill to swallow, isn't it? There's this band I love called Relient K. Relient K is not explicitly a Christian band, but the members of this band are devout Christians. So their faith inspires much of their music, including their most famous song, "Be My Escape." And I know that I have mentioned this song in a sermon before because it is so relevant. There is one lyric in this song that is always in the back of my mind and always helps me to articulate what I believe about grace. And the lyric from "Be My Escape" is, "But the beauty of grace is that it makes life not fair." To me, what this lyric means is that the radical, revolutionary thing about God's grace is that it is given to everyone, even the very people that we believe deserve it the least. That is, in my opinion, the take-home point of this particular parable. When my manager at the bank offered me words of encouragement, essentially forgiving me for making this big mistake, imagine if my coworkers had protested. Imagine if Toby, the coworker who caught the mistake while submitting the batch, had overheard and demanded that I be punished. After all, he was very good at his job, no doubt the best employee we had. He had never made a mistake that big. He could have pointed that out to the manager, gone to him and said, "I've worked here for 5 years. And I've never made such a careless mistake. But where's my reward for not screwing up? Why is she being let off the hook so easily?" But he didn't do that. And I imagine Toby didn't do that for the same reason why my manager did not scold me. Because it could have easily had been them. And if they had been the ones to make the big mistake, they would have hoped for leniency and grace too. Because that's the beauty of grace, right? It's been given to us, but it's also been given to everyone else too. Now, often when this parable is preached on, the pastor's main takeaway is that we should become more forgiving, that we should act in the model of the Father, becoming more Christ-like and leading with forgiveness, grace, and empathy. And that is absolutely true. That is a wonderful takeaway. And if that is the biggest takeaway you get when you study this scripture, you're doing good. But in the context of storytelling, which is what our sermon series is really about, I'd like to take it in a slightly different direction. And I want us to think about what it would look like if we made it our mission to share this story, to tell the story that Emerson and Dickens heralded as the greatest story ever told. Because, my friends, there are people who are lost, people wandering around in search of meaning, of community, of good news, of forgiveness, of reconciliation. There are people who have made some pretty big mistakes in their past, who stand with their stomachs in knots, bracing themselves for punishment, terrified to approach a church, to approach a person of faith, out of fear of judgment. What would it look like if we sought those people? If we met them in the middle, brought them this story? What if we saw them in the distance and ran to them, moved by compassion, with open arms, and said to them, "Sure, you've made mistakes. You know that better than anyone else. But hear this good news. You were lost, but now you are found." That's cause for celebration. My friends, if you have ever made a mistake before, then you know that sometimes the hardest person to find forgiveness from is yourself. The tax collectors and sinners that were dying with Jesus did not need yet another person telling them how horrible they had been, how ashamed they should be. They felt the weight of that shame and that guilt every second of every day. Very few people move about this world completely shameless about their transgressions. Jesus was far more concerned with shaming the people who were shameless than with shaming people who already felt ashamed. He knew that there were people who needed to be told that their behavior was wrong, destructive, and harmful, that had otherwise been living in a world where they really felt like they were the top dog, that they were perfect, that they had never made a mistake, that they were loyal. Right? That they're not the ones who need lectures, who need punished, that's those people over there. But Jesus also knew that the tax collectors and sinners already knew that they had participated in wrong, destructive, and harmful behavior. Many of them came to Jesus and expressed their remorse. They repented for those actions and joined his movement. Like the lost son, they had come to their senses, as the text tells us. They had returned to their father. They had expressed remorse, repented for their transgressions. They had done the work, returned to God, who greeted them with open arms and a word of grace. But to those whose impulse was to protest, to decry what they viewed as unfair, Jesus responded, "So what?" Because the beauty of grace is that it makes life not fair. And that beautiful gift is something worth celebrating. Amen.